Hello again, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the prison experience. And so that correlates to the performance objectives in the class, actually 1 through 5. So, in talking about the prison experience, we're going to talk a little bit about what is known as a prison culture and some of the issues or aspects involved with that. We're going to talk about classification. This is something that we've been talking about a little bit already, so we're going to dive deeper into that. We're going to talk about some facility response to some of the issues, contraband, as well as searches. We're going to shift gears then and focus on women in prison and some of the unique aspects of women who are incarcerated. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some solutions to some of the issues that we are covering. So first and foremost, when we're talking about the prison culture, a lot of times this applies to both men and women who are incarcerated. And the first aspect of that is often just referred to as the prison culture. And now I've talked quite a bit about my experience as a correctional officer, talking about here are some of the things that we deal with, or some of the issues. I've shared some stories of my experiences. Um, What's it like to be an inmate? Obviously, I don't have personal experience there at all. And even if I did, it would just be my experience. It's not representative. And so some of the things that we're going to talk about are some of the overall issues. When we interview or through time, we've really seen some trends. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. And one of the trends is a concept called prisonization. And it's important to remember that prison is essentially a micro society. It is their own social structure, it's their own rules. It's basically a city inside of a city. And so a lot of the aspects of maybe the city that you live in, or if you've moved around and noticed different um, norms or kind of social structure or rules that differ from city to city, we see that same concept inside a prison. And the concept of prisonization is just a term that we use to refer to the adaptation that happens. They become prisonized. They ultimately forget how to live on the outside. They get so adept to living in that prison world with someone telling you when you're going to wake up, when you're going to eat, when you're going to sleep, when you're going to play. Um, when someone is telling you what you're going to do or how you're going to feel every hour of your day, you adapt to that. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons that offenders struggle so much after they're released to the outside world and there's not someone telling them what to do and when to do it. We see that adaptation. Basic psychology tells you that if you treat someone like an animal, they're going to act like an animal. And so we shouldn't be really surprised at how inmates may act out in jail. They may fight or be outwardly disobedient and disrespectful. And that may or may not be how they are in the outside. And a lot of that is the psychological aspects of being incarcerated. So prisonization is really just the process of adaptation. We basically teach you how to be a good inmate. We also know that there's a prison code, and basically these are sometimes the unwritten rules of prison life. Of course, we have the very written rules, policies, procedures, aspects that every inmate needs to follow, but we also know that there are these unwritten rules in this whole prison code that is established, and sometimes it even is in secret communication. Um, in order to keep it secret in these unwritten rules, they develop and it evolves over time, this very secretive communication going on. Similar to the outside world, we also have a definite hierarchy among inmates. When you look at the outside world, we have the leaders and the followers. It's no different in prison. Again, prison is really just a city inside of a city. And so that whole hierarchy exists in the inside of a prison, just like in the outside world. We also know that sometimes that includes sexual roles. Prison rape is very, very real. A lot of times it's heteronormally, or in the outside world, they're heterosexual males, however, are engaging in homosexual activity inside the facility. That unwritten rule or that prison code is they have punks. Again, similar to the outside world, we have leaders and followers. And they might have control over another. And in the prison world, we call that a punk, and essentially that's who they are raping. In the prison world, we also have what are known as STGs, and that's a security threat group. Now, for the most part, with STGs, we're talking about gangs. What's interesting, however, is sometimes gangs that exist in the outside world also exist within the prison walls. And a lot of times inmates, if they're affiliated with a gang in the outside world, they're going to be affiliated with that same gang on the inside world. However, we do see some inmates who had no gang affiliation on the outside will join a gang in the inside world, um, just for the protection that they feel that they need. We also have some gangs that are unique to prison, and we don't see those particular gangs in the outside world. The bottom line, it's about power and control, and feeling when ultimately, again, that prisonization, we've basically taken any control that an individual has, we take it away. And a human need is to feel some level of control, and so that seems to compound gang issues. Inside the facility, we have a concept called contraband. And basically, contraband is defined as anything that they are not allowed to have. So anything within the policies and procedures of what an inmate can have in their cell, anything beyond that is contraband. So sometimes it is a weapon, obviously a dangerous, and a lot of times the weapons, you can't have them on the outside world as well. But basically it's anything that violates the prison rule. So it could be an extra blanket. It could be having, too many sets of clothes, or an extra pillow, or anything more. Like I said, anything, too many books, too much food that they've bought on canteen. Contraband is basically anything more that's allowed. We see a significant issue with hoarding. And again, that reason for basically, again, when we take control away, we'll see them try to control any aspect of their life. Sometimes it's trying to beat the system, it's rebellion, sometimes it's mental illness. But we do see, having too much sugar packets, or too many toothbrushes, too much salt, too many cups. It's really endless as far as what inmates will hoard. Sometimes it's just an attempt to beat the system. Sometimes they believe it's out of a need. But again, we see a lot of what we refer to as hoarding. And basically, the primary way that we monitor that is through shakedowns. And basically, a shakedown is when you go into a housing unit and you pull all the inmates out of their cell, and you go through every single cell looking for hoarding, looking through for contraband, anything that they can't have, whether it's just they simply can't have it, such as a weapon, or it's having too much of something. We also deal with contraband through searches. Now, ultimately, we can frisk an inmate really at any given time. A lot of times we will frisk them anytime there's movement. So if they leave the housing unit to go down to booking or some type of program or work, when they come back, we might frisk. We might do a pat search of them just to make sure that they're not bringing in anything or even taking out anything. We could do it before they leave as well to make sure they're not bringing anything down to this program that they can't have. We do conduct strip searches. These are going to be general, gender similar, so I can only do a strip search of female inmates, so it's gender specific. For the most part, we're really only doing strip searches when someone first comes into the facility, or if they've left the facility and come back for something, we will do a strip search. Rarely, if we believe somebody is hiding something, or if there's been an incident, we might do a strip search to see if they're hiding. Quite frankly, in strip searches, I have found drugs in vaginas. I found a gun in a vagina. So there's obviously a definite need for that type of search. However, body cavity searches, these need to be done by medical personnel. There's always stereotypes out there about body cavity searches. Again, the drugs in the vagina. Once I saw that there was something obviously not quite right in doing the strip search, that's when we call in the medical professionals. By no means did I remove that. In order to do a body cavity search, it needs to be done by a medical professional. As a correctional officer, we cannot do that level of search. All right, so I want to talk more specifically about classification. Again, this is a concept that was introduced a few weeks ago, but this week I want to dive a little bit deeper into it. And basically, all classification is ultimately it's subdividing inmates into different categories to bat to match, excuse me, their needs, their risks, as well as resources that we might have. Ultimately, we see two different types of classification. There is external classification. Now, this applies to prison, not jail. External classification is figuring out what level of prison does someone need. Now, ultimately, this is going to be based, for the most part, in the level of risk. Because, of course, we have maximum security facilities, we have medium security facilities, and we have minimum security facilities. And sometimes we've even got some in between that. For example, I live in Minnesota, and we have a prison classification called close. It falls between medium and maximum. So external classification is figuring out what prison someone is going to go to based on risk for the most part. However, we do see external classification based a little bit on need. For example, we have a couple prisons that are specific to types of offenses. So, for example, sex offender treatment is only provided at a couple different prisons. And so that's going to play a role. If someone needs sex offender treatment, that's going to play a role on external classification. The same goes with different chemical dependency or education or age might be one of the criteria that we take into consideration for external classification. So external classification is figuring out what prison someone is going to go to. Once we've figured out external classification, then we need to classify them internally. And so this basically is determining what housing unit or cell block they're going to go to on the inside. So even once we've decided what prison is most appropriate, we know that there's going to be a lot of different aspects or options in that prison. And a lot of times we sort those by cell block. So for instance, if someone is mandated to complete an education program, they need to get their GED. So within the prison, they might house all of those inmates in the same housing unit. Or if someone is in an intensive chemical dependency treatment program, they're going to be housed in the same housing unit. If someone has a job and is in some type of trade training, they're going to be housed in the same cell block. So internal classification most often is based on the needs of the inmate, figuring out based on what they need, what cell block is most appropriate. But we're also going to take into consideration some of their behavioral characteristics. And so one of the tools that we use is known as AIMS. AIMS is an acronym for Adult Internal Management System. Basically, this is a tool, an assessment tool that we use once someone has come to prison. Different facilities are going to have a different classification period. So sometimes it's over several weeks, sometimes it's a couple months. Some facilities don't have that long of an assessment period. But basically, this is one of the tools that we look at, but really looks at their personality and their behavior, because the bottom line is we need to make sure that it is safe for everyone to house someone or an offender with other offenders. Sometimes it's their own security risk, their own explosive behavior or very, very violent behavior. Sometimes it's inmates who are vulnerable themselves. We see this a lot of times with sex offender or people with maybe some mental health issues or some drug issues, or if they have mental health issues and they're on some pretty heavy duty psychotropics to manage their mental illness, sometimes that makes them vulnerable to other inmates. And then some inmates are very low risk. Their behavior is deemed very, very normal, and so are very easily housed with other inmates. So let's take a look just real quick at this specific tool. I know this is a little bit difficult to read. I will be giving you or sending you a PDF of this. So again, this is that AIMS checklist. And so basically it goes through several different observational through observation of the correctional officers or the classification officers. They're looking for different behaviors. And so what this first pages go through is different types of behaviors that they are observing. For example, easily upset. Any change of routine causes him to erupt in some type of outburst, or they're moody. They need constant supervision, where if they they always need to be supervised. That's a high needs inmate. Um, is an agitator about race. If you hear comments or um, seem to um, either to make comments against a race or only stick with their own race. Sometimes that's a red flag as far as who or where they can be housed. And so we have lots and lots of behavioral characteristics that we are going to be looking for. Then the last page, now this is all computerized, so basically this is just a printout. It's the best I could do. So basically through observation and in those classification units, we're going to be looking for these things every single day for a period of time, and we're going to be ranking them whether or not they have it or not. And so it's 0 or 1, and we will rank them, and we'll have several different officers throughout a series of time ranking the inmates, and then ultimately classify as far as their risk and needs um, in their housing unit, or what cell block we are going to send them to. Having a good classification system is really, really important. And one of the things that I talked about last week is we have a legal responsibility to keep offenders safe. And so one of the ways we can do that is through a good classification system. It allows us to keep the aggressive inmates separate from the non-aggressive inmates. Having a good classification system helps us avoid misclassification. Basically, we don't want to misdiagnose someone as or who might be aggressive. We don't want to misdiagnose them as passive when they are aggressive. Again, we have a legal responsibility to keep everyone safe. So having a good, thorough classification system helps us to avoid misclassification. It also helps us to avoid overclassification. Basically, if we don't have a good system in place, we are more likely to overestimate risks. And ultimately, when we classify someone as a higher risk than what they might actually be, that costs us money. It is more expensive. The higher risk that someone is classified, the more it costs to house them. And so having a good system, a thorough system in place, helps us to avoid overclassification. And ultimately, again, it's cost effective. It is much less expensive to house a lower risk inmate than a higher risk inmate. Some of the characteristics that tend to play a role in classification, the first one is age. Old inmates are less likely to have aggressive personalities or cause problems in a facility than young. Inmates who have a history of violence, that will tend to continue on the inside. If they have a history of violence on the outside or in their past incarcerations, if they had a history of violence, they're more likely to continue that. Inmates who have mental illness generally are higher risk than inmates who are not. Inmates who have a known gang affiliation on the outside will continue that, and they are a higher risk inmate on the inside. Program participation lowers your risk. Keeping inmates busy, inmates who go to the programs, who want to have a job and want to go to different programs provided by the facility, whether it be religion or some type of self-help group. Active participation in programs lowers their risk. If they've had recent disciplinary action while they're in the facility, they're a higher risk. There's a lot of misconceptions about what might influence someone's level of risk. So for example, a lot of people think sentence length, and I've actually seen this go either way, but a lot of people will think that the longer someone's sentence is, the higher risk they have because they don't have anything to lose. What I have found is that is just the opposite is true. For the most part, if someone is serving multiple years or even life in prison, they want to have as many luxuries or as many rewards, as much freedom as they possibly can. So a lot of times these are going to be the best inmates. The severity of the offense is another misconception. Um, just because someone is in for a very violent crime doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be violent on the inside. A lot of times, again, that correlates with their sentence length. A lot of times they're going to be getting the longer sentence. And so they want to have as much freedom and as many benefits as they can. And so they're going to be the ones to follow the rules. The time left. This one we can see it go either way. Sometimes someone, as they are nearing release, get very, very stressed. The unknown of what's going to happen when they're released is overwhelming. And so sometimes they are going to be the inmates that act out and have disciplinary issues shortly before they are released. So those are some of the things that are misconceptions about what might influence classification. One of the challenges that we have is overcrowding. Basically, in order to have a good classification system, you have to have room to move inmates around, meaning that you have open cells. When we are overcrowded, we don't have any room to move folks around. A good classification system basically says 90% occupancy is best. That means we have 10% of our cells open. That means we have some freedom to move inmates around into different housing units. Considering most facilities operate at about 115% capacity, we don't have that room to move inmates around to different cell blocks. And so that really challenges having a good classification system. Sometimes what cell block you go to is more based on, okay, where do we have room? Versus where do we meet your risk and needs. A good classification system also involves what is known as reclassification. At a minimum, inmates should be reclassified every 12 months. And actually, most research says that we do it more often than that. It's especially important if an inmate has never been in prison before, if this is their first time, because again, we're more likely to overestimate someone's risk. And so we want to be reclassifying them so they can earn a lower risk. Because again, the higher risk you are, the less freedom you have, the less you have the ability to go to programs and move. And so we want to provide them with some level of hope. They basically need um, an incentive to follow the rules. And if they know that, okay, if I can show that for 6 months, I can have really good behavior, that might allow them to be reclassified to a lower risk level, which is going to give them more privileges while they're in the facility. Again, this also is more cost effective because the lower risk that someone is, the cheaper it is to incarcerate them. We also incorporate what we call unit management system. Now, I've already talked about this a little bit. Basically, this is just a division of different cell blocks for specific programs. So again, if someone needs chemical dependency treatment, they might have a separate housing unit for them. If in women's prisons, they might have specific cell blocks for young mothers or pregnant inmates. Those that are really serious about their education, if the prison allows college credit, they might be in a different housing unit. Again, the very old, we have geriatric, we literally have nursing homes inside of prisons. And so that's just referred to as a unit management system. It's just having separate cell blocks that meet a specific need. All right, we're going to shift gears and talk now about females in prison. And it's important to remember that in our entire criminal justice system, women have been treated differently in our history in all three components. So in law enforcement, the courts, as well as corrections, we have seen a definite difference in how we treat women. And so corrections is no different. One of the aspects that we have some differences is in our female facilities. First and foremost, we have very limited availability. So in Minnesota, we have 11 different prisons. Only one of them is specific to women, and that particular prison houses all levels. So we have minimum, medium, and maximum security in that one prison. And of course, that leads to some issues. Security is obviously an issue. And that really boils down to the limited availability. Now, when we talk specifically about female inmates, a lot of a lot of research will say that women have taken a different path to incarceration. Basically, what we mean by that is just different than men. Now, all offenders have a disproportionate percentage of previous physical or sexual abuse. That applies to both men and women. However, when we look at women specifically, we know that it is even higher than men. We basically see about 40% of women report some level of physical or sexual abuse. We see also higher levels of poverty. Now, of course, poverty applies to both men and women, but when we look at female inmates specifically, it's even higher. We also know that about 2/3 of women in a federal facility are there because of drugs, whether their addiction led to crime or their crime is in selling drugs. We know that female facilities also have their own subculture. It's that inmate code that we see in men's prisons, excuse me, but it's very, very different in female facilities. Women tend to develop what are known as pseudo families. Now, some research says, okay, do these exist? They are very, very real. We're basically inside. It's so very odd. But inside some female facilities, it's basically like playing house, where women take the different roles to a family where, okay, you're going to be the mom, you're going to be the dad, you're going to be our children. And that's known as a pseudo family. And ultimately those develop because they need emotional support, just like on the outside. They tend to need that on the inside. They also need that social structure, that stability that these pseudo families provide. So it's extremely interesting, but again, is very unique to women's prisons. We also know that obviously female inmates do require different types of programming, and ultimately we call that being gender responsive. Probably one of the biggest issues that we deal is the number of women who come to prison and are pregnant. On average, we are delivering about 4,000 babies in prison. And where we kind of are torn here, or where we really have to do a balancing act, is we know how important it is for the mother and child to bond right after birth, and that the more we can bond that child to this adult, the better off that child is going to be in their early development, and ultimately which is going to impact their lifelong development. So we are torn between, here's a woman that we have incarcerated, and we know that it's absolutely vital to this newborn baby to bond with their mother, but the mother is incarcerated, and so we're really stuck on what to do. And so because of that, we have seen the development of what we call community prison mother programs, where basically this is an opportunity for women to have their children live with them. Sometimes it's just for weekends, sometimes it's every other weekend or shorter periods of time, because ultimately we want to have that bond with that mother and child. And we know this woman is eventually going to be released. These children are going to eventually come back to that mother's care. And so keeping that relationship established is really, really important. And so we see lots of programs being developed in prison. I'm going to switch gears and we're going to watch a quick video on one of these programs. So bear with me, this video should start automatically.
Newsstands and the internet today takes a stark look at a growing trend in the nation's prisons. NBC News has teamed up with the Griot and Essence magazine to take a closer look at mothers raising their babies behind bars. At least 9 U.S. prisons allow nonviolent offenders who give birth while locked up to keep their babies with them for up to 18 months. NBC's Mara Schiavo-Campo has been following this story and has more. What did you find?
Well, Contessa, these programs are really designed to keep the mother and child together. They reflect a new sense of social responsibility from the prisons, and they want to preserve that bond to hopefully lead to a stronger future for both the mother and the child. Bedford Hills has the country's oldest prison nursery, and 7-month-old Delilah is one of its youngest residents. Charlene was newly pregnant when sentenced. The thought of having her baby in prison was devastating, and she almost decided not to.
I'm very anti-abortion, but of course the thought is going to cross your mind, because who wants to actually have a baby in prison and not be able to stay with the baby? I actually made an appointment not to have her. I couldn't do it. I was like, no. So I kept her.
Delilah is one of 9 babies living at Bedford Hills. Here, the infants do leave their unit.
Baby movement!
When the mothers go to mandated programs, the babies go to daycare, staffed by other inmates, like Sherelle Howard, serving 16 years to life for robbery. She says being with the babies is the bright spot of each day.
I just robbed and stole because I had a habit to take care of, but I'm not getting high anymore, so there's no habit to take care of, and I have a habit with the babies now. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
On her first birthday, Delilah will have to leave Bedford Hills to go home with her siblings and aunt, while Charlene serves out the rest of her sentence.
Do you think about what it's going to be like for Delilah to have to leave you when you're her whole world?
I know she's going to feel Mommy's not here.
It'll be a bittersweet moment, parting with her daughter while knowing it's the best thing for the baby.
As much as I would love to be able to keep her here a little longer, I want her to know more than just other inmates and officers. I want her to see beyond these walls.
Now, studies have shown mothers who participate in the programs have lower reoffense rates than other inmates, but critics argue that the Department of Corrections should not be in the child care business.
I mean, there's two sides to this. Either, I mean, one way to look at it is you're imprisoning babies as well when you have them in the prisons.
Right.
The other way is if you're separating them, you're punishing those babies to be without their mom in crucial early life years.
Yeah, and that's exactly what proponents argue, is that why punish the baby? This is really to preserve the baby's future as much as it is for the mothers, and studies have shown that it is beneficial for the mothers long term.
What about if dads want to start having their babies in prison?
A great point. I mean, these are all things that they have to consider, but so far the prisons that are doing it feel like it's worth the expense and the issue.
Mara, thank you.
Thank you.
For more stories and video on this important issue, you can go to thegrio.com report.
All right, so that video did a really good job of explaining the program and then really talk about, as with everything, there are definite benefits and drawbacks. And, some people are adamantly opposed. And like she said at the end, prison shouldn't be, the Department of Corrections shouldn't be in daycare, and I understand that. Really we look in what's in the best interest of the child, and even there's some disagreement on that. So with that, some even argue whether or not children should visit in prison. And there's a statistic out there that 75% of women, when they come to prison, had dependent children, meaning children prior to incarceration were in their care. Now, only 25% of them were able to go to the other parent, which means then 50% then of them are going to some type of foster care, whether it be, other family members or maybe even with outside of the family. And so some argue should children visit their mothers or even for their fathers in prison. And again, we see benefits and drawbacks of that. Yes, sometimes it can be very traumatic. Sometimes they don't understand. Sometimes they learn that, prison really isn't that scary of a place. And of course, that's not the impact that we want. But again, maintaining that bond is really important. It's important to remember that the vast majority of inmates are going to be released someday, and they're going to be reunited with those children. And so for the most part, our research shows that keeping that relationship established is really, really important. We also need to keep in mind some effects that we know incarceration has on children. Basically, when we are talking about juvenile delinquency, we know that when a parent is incarcerated, it leads to instability. When we look at basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs and some of those basic needs of feeling secure and safe housing, children can't learn or have struggled to learn if they are not or they don't feel that their housing is stable. A lot of times mom might be incarcerated because of a very traumatic event that the child has experienced. And we know children who experience trauma are more likely to become delinquent. It interrupts their development, basically their physical development, their emotional development, as well as their cognitive development when mom is incarcerated. And again, all of this, simply having a parent who is incarcerated means, or statistically means that that child is 6 times more likely to engage in delinquent acts than kids whose parents are not incarcerated. And so those are some of the things that we need to take into consideration when we're talking about children of parents who are incarcerated. All right, again, in being gender responsive, we know that women have different medical needs than men. And again, as I said last week, it wasn't until 1994 that gynecological services were incorporated for women in prison. We also know as women age, they have differing medical issues, whether it be, ovarian, breast or uterine cancer. As they enter menopause, they have different medical needs. And so we see some of these needs being very different than men. We also, as I said earlier, we have higher rates of needs for psychological services for women who are incarcerated. Ultimately, when we're looking at solutions for some of these issues, as I said, at the federal level, we know 2/3 of women are there because of drug issues. And so probably one of the primary things that we're looking at is, what are our alternatives? Are there other ways to punish someone other than incarceration? Obviously preventing it is key, but is a treatment program more appropriate? Maybe a treatment program combined with electronic monitoring. We're really looking at solutions other than incarceration, specifically for drug offenders. We're also, even for other types of offenses, we're getting very, very creative. Different types of intensive supervision, probation might be an option. And a lot of times we're doing this primarily because of those dependent children. And some say, that's not fair, that's treating men and women differently. And I totally understand that. But ultimately, as a system and really as a society, knowing the future of these children, we really need to find some alternatives. Some states are dabbling, for lack of better terms, with co-correctional institutions. Basically, these are going to be prisons that house both men and women. We know that psychologically it's very important to be exposed to the opposite sex. And so some states are opening what they're calling co-correctional. Of course, their housing units are separate, but are bringing men and women together for different work and educational programs to have that interaction to meet some of those psychological needs. Of course, with that comes issues. Whether it be abuse, sexual assault, women, for example, if they have a history of abuse from men, being around men is not comfortable for them, or might create even more issues. So again, with every solution, we know that there's benefits and drawbacks, and that's something we struggle with to balance